So again, good evening. Thanks for joining our January LCAP meeting for Burbank Unified. My name is Robin Anders, and I am the Director of Instructional Technology and Accountability. This evening, we have joining us Dr. Paramo and Mr. Cantwell, Dr. Paramo, our Superintendent of Schools, and Mr. Andy Cantwell is our Assistant Superintendent of Business, our business office. Also with us are translators Anna Arzumanian and Liz Costella. I'm going to give them a minute to explain the process for joining our translation channels. So Anna, if you could start with explaining that to our Armenian speakers.
Yes, thank you, Robin. Բարի երեկո, ես Անա Արզումանյանն եմ, մեր շրջանի հայոց եւ ռուսաց լեզուների թարգմանիչը։ Այսօր մեր LCAP LCFF բյուջեի ընդհանուր բյուջեի առաջին ժողովն է, այնպես որ մեր այսօրվա հաղորդումը վարում է դոկտոր Ռոբին Էնդերսը, ներկա է նաև մեր գերատեսուչը դոկտոր Ջան Պարամոն, ինչպես նաև պարոն Էնդրու Քանթվելը։ Նրանք երեքը կներկայացնեն այսօրվա նյութը։ Այս հաղորդումը այսօր ձայնագրվում է եւ կտեղադրվի մեր կայքեջում, ինչպես նաև եթե հարցեր ունեք, կարող եք գրել chat բաժնում, նաև հայոց լեզվով ես այն կթարգմանեմ։ Եթե մտնելու եք իմ սենյակը, եթե խնդրում եմ chat-ի մեջ գրեք, որ այստեղ եք ինձ լսում եք։ Շատ հետաքրքիր է, եթե մարդ կա իմ սենյակում, թե ոչ։ Շնորհակալություն ձեր ներկայության համար բարի վայելում։ Back to you, Robin.
Thank you, Anna. And with us tonight is Liz, who last minute is helping with Spanish translation. So thank you, Liz, if you want to explain to our Spanish speakers how to access that channel.
Absolutely. Buenas noches, mi nombre es Liz Costella y voy a traducir para ustedes en español hoy para la Junta de LCAP. En la parte de abajo de su pantalla va a haber un mundo en un minuto cuando lo abran, va a escoger el idioma español. Eso nos va a poner en otro cuarto donde voy a traducir la Junta en español. No voy a poder verlos o platicar con ustedes, pero pueden usar el chat y yo voy a estar mirando para asegurar si están poniendo allí. Cuando lo acaban de abrir, si quieres escoger español, y luego voy a estar en ese cuarto para poder traducirles. Gracias.
Thank you. So I've enabled the chat channel or the interpretation channels. You'll see a globe at the bottom of the screen. Again, tonight's topic for our LCAP is an LCFF overview and our initial budget discussion for next year's LCAP, our 25-26 plan. Also be providing an update on our current budget for this year at first interim, as far as where we are with our expenditures on the items we said we would fund for this year. With that, we will be speaking slow this evening for our translators. That's my own reminder and a reminder to everyone else, but just so you understand why our cadence may be slow this evening. I'm going to start our presentation and then we will get started. I believe everyone can see that at home. So here we go. I'm going to turn it over to our Assistant Superintendent of Business, Mr. Cantwell, to talk us through these first couple slides of our overall LCFF budget.
Good evening. My name is Andy Cantwell. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Administrative Services. Before I go further, Robin, you can just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. It's my privilege this evening to review our current year budget. I will admit that I am usually the culprit that requires the interpreters to remind us to slow down. And so I'm going to try really hard to slow myself down. I also will apologize that I'm not there in person. I've been battling the flu. I've got my Theraflu that I'm sipping on and hope to make it through this presentation. If you are interested in more information on our district budget, myself and Dr. Abdel Hamid, our fiscal director, presented the first interim budget at the December board meeting on December 13th. So again, if you'd like information with greater specificity beyond what we can go through today, then I encourage you to review the recording of our December board meeting where we presented in greater depth. I know many of you have been in these meetings before, so not to insult you, but to remind you of our budgeting process. We are required to adopt our budget by July 1st. We operate on a fiscal year budget that is tied to the school year. So July 1 of any particular year to the following June 30. We adopt that budget based on the governor's best guidance, Department of Finance, Legislative Analyst Office, and ultimately what's approved at the state level through the state legislature. We work all through the fall to be monitoring the revenues that come to us from the state. We update based on staffing levels all of our expenditures. And in December, we bring forward our first interim revision. And so that's what tonight's presentation will be, is the first formal revision to the budget that is made available to the public and adopted by the board. Robin, go ahead to the next slide. So anytime we're looking at a budget, we don't just look at the current year, but we look at the current year plus the 2 out years. So for the current year, that would be obviously the 24-25 fiscal year. I'm seeing notes that the Spanish audio is not working. Liz, I noticed that your mic says it's muted, whereas Anna's is not. Hopefully in the chat box, we can see if that helps. What I was sharing was that we look at the 24-25 fiscal year, plus we look at the following 2 years. So that's the 25-26 and the 26-27 year. And so when we look at this page, I state some of our assumptions that we have to make for the multi-year projection. We're using the Department of Finance statutory COLA. What that means is that each year, if the legislature approves a cost of living adjustment, we have factored that in. We don't know what that will be until late spring. And so right now we're using an estimate for next year. And just a tangent for a moment, I will share that the budget that was presented in December and the one we're reviewing tonight used a cost of living adjustment for next year of 2.93%. Now, just 2 weeks ago, the governor presented an updated version of his budget for next year where he cut that by 0.5%. The impact to Burbank Unified is nearly $1 million lost for each of the next 2 years. And so just for those who may have seen some of the headlines on our state budget, it looks better than we have seen in the past 18 months. However, education was not spared. The COLA was reduced, which will directly impact Burbank Unified. We also have assumed certain expenditure increases, for instance, utilities, our health insurance, our pensions, which are mandated by the state that we fund. For classified employees, that's PERS. For certificate employees, that's STIRS. And you'll see at the very bottom of here, a really large increase is our insurance premiums to our joint power authority. As a school district, we self-insure some of our risk, workers' compensation, property and liability, and then we purchase insurance for larger risk. And right now, school districts across the state are seeing 20, 30, 40% premium increases year over year. And so that's one of our biggest increases as we look to the future. But before we look further into the future, let's look at the present. Robin, go to the next slide.
Just a reminder for our translators.
My apologies for going fast. This is really the most important slide of the evening that I have for you. What I want to draw your attention to is the bold line that shows ending fund balance for the current year. And there is a typo in that middle column that should say 2025-26. And the final column should say 26-27. So this is that multi-year projection that I was just alluding to. The takeaway from this slide is that you can see our revenue and our expenditures. I'm going to distill it to the most critical line, and that's the ending fund balance. We begin this year with $37 million of a reserve. You can think of that as our savings account to start the year. And we are spending $9 million more than we're receiving from the state. And that's why our ending fund balance will be $28.7 million at the end of this fiscal year. That's a real-time number based on our recent update. So we believe with confidence that the ending fund balance will be very close to that. Now, if you look at the 2 out years, you'll see we continue to deficit spend more than we receive from the state. And so next year, we start the year with that $28 million number that you saw that I just mentioned for 24-25. That's our savings account or our beginning fund balance for the next year. And we are spending $10 million more than we receive as a district. And that's why it goes down to 18 million at the end of next year. You look at that last column set, you can see the 18 million carries over to the beginning fund balance for the last year. And once again, approximately $10 million deficit brings our ending fund balance down to 7.5 million in just 2 years. Here's why that's really important. We are required by the state to maintain a reserve for economic uncertainties. That's 3% of our overall budget. So even though it looks like we have $7.5 million available to us in 2 years, 6,735,000 of that is a reserve that we cannot access without state approval. So really those funds are only available in true fiscal crises and are not something that we could regularly access. So for all intents and purposes, we are ending 2 years from now with 0 as our ending fund balance. That's why we're at a really critical juncture to begin to continue the work to solve our structural deficit. Last year, during our LCAP meetings and during the budget building process and budget adoption process, we had some really painful discussions. We talked about the loss of some critical people to our district because of these budgetary challenges. And I regret to share tonight that we are not out of the woods yet. The county has approved our budget. They've given us a positive certification, but they've told us that we must continue to address our structural deficit by reducing our expenditures. Those expenditures must come from LCAP, and again, we'll talk about that shortly, as well as need to be coming from the broader general fund budget. Robin, go ahead to the next slide. You can see that our revenues from last year, that's the first pie chart on this slide, was $221.7 million. At budget adoption, we knew we were going to be losing funding because we received certain one-time funds last year. And the state also entered into a fiscal state of emergency at the state level that cut spending to education. And so we began this year with a budgeted revenue of $204.7 million. At first interim, we are anticipating an increase in federal revenue. Now, I don't need to state the obvious, but federal revenue is a very perilous position right now, and we do not know what the new administration will do for funding education. And so that increase that you're seeing at first interim is one in which we are cautiously optimistic will be realized. On the expenditure side, go ahead and flip it over to the expenditures, Robin.
In a second, we have a question in the audience.
Okay.
Why does the first interim budget say 206, but then the 24-25 revenue says 172? Where is that difference?
Where did you see the 172?
The slide prior,
Was that-
24-25 revenue, 172.
Excellent. Thank you for allowing me to clarify that. So that slide previously was focusing on the LCFF revenues and unrestricted funding sources. This shows all funding that the district receives, which would include, again, I just mentioned federal revenue, which comes to us restricted. We only can use it primarily for special education and for supporting vulnerable populations, specifically primarily low income through Title I funding. We have other state revenues like lottery funding. Again, much of that comes to us restricted, only to be used for instructional materials. And so that's the difference between when we talked about the unrestricted general fund and as we now look at overall revenue for the district. On the expenditure side, you'll see what appears to be a really large jump. I will assure you that the majority of that is because of the carryover from last year on the restricted side. So let me explain that. When we receive one-time funding, which the district received nearly $20 million a year and a half ago for learning recovery coming out of COVID, and in arts, music, and instructional materials discretionary block grant. Those two funding sources, we don't budget in those out years, even though we know we're not going to fully expend it in the current year. We wait until we close the books. And at first interim each year, you'll always see a spike on the expenditure side as we roll over the carry forward. And we budget for expenditures proportionate to that carry forward. So while this delta or this change looks significant, it really is directly tied to those carryover funds and a nature of the way in which school districts across the state are directed to budget. If anyone like me finds that frustrating, I will share that we attempted to institute what to me appears to be a more intuitive way of budgeting, where we don't wait until we close the books to roll those funds forward. And we brought in the leading experts in the state, the Financial Crisis and Management Assistance Team, also known as FCMAT, to review all of our budgeting practices. And they were the ones that told us we must maintain this same policy, which is what is the audit guidance at the state level. All right. I mentioned a little bit ago that we are required by the state to pay into the pensions for our employees. These are promises made and promises that should be kept. However, these are also expenditures that we have zero control over. And so one way to look at this is the state tells us that for every $1 of compensation a non-instructional or non-credentialed staff member receives, the district pays 27 cents for each $1 of compensation they receive into their pension. That's been going up each year. Coming out of the Great Recession of 2008, we were paying about 10%, and so this amount has nearly tripled in the past 15 years. For teachers and other credentialed staff, for every $1 of salary they receive, the district contributes an additional 19 cents, 19.1%, into the teacher retirement system. So again, as these have increased, the teacher's retirement contribution has doubled over the past decade. These are significant cost drivers for the district. Again, we're not having commentary on the importance of fulfilling these promises that have been made for lifelong educators. However, it is an expense that continues to increase each year without the state finding a way to help fund it at the district level. Another significant increase in expenditures is health insurance. For budgeting purposes, we assume a 7% increase in premiums year over year. What we saw this current year was approximately 12% increase. And so we may be aggressive in assuming that this will come in closer to 7% in those following years. I mentioned these as just two examples. Utilities is one I've already mentioned also. Everyone who's local has received their BWP rate increases. We received those also. And so even when we talk about a potential cost of living adjustment coming to the district, before accounting for the impact of enrollment decline, there are certain expenditures that go up each year that more than offset the COLA that comes to districts.
Mr. Campbell, we have a question in the audience, and then I'll read the question in the chat after we take our in-person question.
I noticed that there is a difference between the PERS amount and the STRS amount required to fulfill our commitment. Is there a cost share in place for the employees that are receiving that benefit, or is it fully funded by the district?
Excellent question. Great question. So it's different for the two groups. For teachers, they do not pay into Social Security. There are different rates depending on when they started working for California public schools. It's not just when they worked for Burbank, but if they worked for a California public school district previously, that would be the date determinative. Roughly speaking, teachers pay between 8 and 10% of their own salary into the pension in addition to the employer contribution. For classified employees, it's about the same. Again, it varies depending on whether you started before 2013. January 1 of 2013 is when there were certain pension reform measures that came into existence. But roughly speaking, our classified employees are paying their 6.2% into Social Security plus paying 8 to 10% into the pension.
Thank you.
The question in the chat, I'm going to read aloud for our live participants. Since you have gone through this last year and also years prior, what are we doing differently to make it better? Every year, your only solution is to cut jobs and programs. I would think after years of experience, you all would have better solutions. Perhaps you all possibly forgot we are BUSD. I think that's the collective, but Mr. Cantwell, if you want to respond, and then.
Yeah, that's, again, it is painful. It does feel like these conversations are on repeat. We have had budgetary challenges for a number of years. Our teachers who have been with us for 20 years know how many years they suffered without receiving any compensation increase, any negotiated increase. We finally received some one-time funding during COVID, and now it feels like that's been pulled away again, because it has. Anyone who runs a private business or works in finance or accounting knows there's two ways to solve a structural deficit. You either reduce expenditures or you increase revenue. For school districts in California, we are not funded primarily based on our local property taxes like many other states are. We are funded through a formula at the state level. That formula is based on not enrollment, even though that's what we have to staff on. If we have 30 students in a classroom, we have a teacher and we have 30 desks, we have 30 textbooks. We only are funded based on how many on average attend each day. So one of the things that we've been doing is trying to increase attendance. Now, following COVID, this has been a real challenge because we just spent years reminding people if they are sick, they should stay home. And so we don't want to encourage students who reasonably should be home to come to school purely for the sake of helping increase our revenue, although it would do that. But we have had communication and we've had initiatives going out to the community to remind them of just how important it is to have your students in class when they're able to be. Likewise, something that Robin will talk about through this evening is the impact of completing a free and reduced meal application or otherwise qualifying for our supplemental funding. That's, again, the main source of our discussion tonight for LCAP. Every student who qualifies, we receive more than $2,000 additional. And so that's why you saw many communications coming out from the district and from principals this fall, encouraging or reminding family members or families to complete the forms and to help ensure that we are properly accounting for all of our families who qualify. On the enrollment side, we have a couple of years ago reduced the number of hours that an individual needs to work in Burbank in order to qualify for an inter-district permit request. And so we have one of the highest percentages in the area of students who don't reside in Burbank but who come to our district. It's about 10%. That's because of a lot of active outreach of trying to build really attractive programs that families want to send their children to, and then getting the word out that they're able to attend our district regardless of their residence if they work for an employer or work otherwise for at least 10 hours a week in Burbank. So seeking to increase enrollment, seeking to increase attendance, and seeking to properly account for all students who would qualify for supplemental funding are the main ways that we're trying to increase revenue. But clearly it is an inadequate solution alone. I'm seeing a lot in the chat box as I was speaking, so Robin, if you could help.
Yeah, you
navigate that.
addressed some of these, but you mentioned enrollment declining. It moves on me, so I gotta find it again. There you go. The more cuts we are having to make because of enrollment and decline, this will bring in less revenue. Do we have any options or thinking about how to change that before it implodes? And I guess it's correlating the declining enrollment with fewer revenues.
Yeah. I wish that I was able to talk publicly more frequently about the positive, because there is so much positive in our district and our community. But the reality is that our district has seen significant enrollment decline already, loss of students, and we have the data. These are not families who are choosing to leave Burbank for private schools or because they're unhappy with our district. By and large, it is about larger demographic trends of the lack of affordable housing in the area, the reduced birth rates, the increase in the average age of maternity of women who are first-time mothers. These sorts of societal changes are what's leading to LA County as a whole to anticipate an 18% decrease in enrollment over the next 9 years. We worked with a specialist, a demographer who looks at enrollment trends, birth rates, looks at all of the developments that are local, slated to come online. And their best estimate was that we as a district will likely see a similar enrollment decline to the rest of LA County. In the best case scenario, if some of the development that's right now in permitting is able to come online, that might mean closer to a 14% decline. Worst case scenario, if some of those projects don't come online, it could be as high as a 22% decline. How does that impact schools? So I'm going to try to, since we don't have a slide for this, I'm going to try to use some round numbers. If we have 100 students at a school and we have staffed that school based on 100 kiddos, if we lose 5 of those students, with them would go about $75,000 of funding. That's about the cost of a teacher. But we still have 95 kids. There's no way we can actually shut down a classroom. Likely, the way it actually works at a school site would be, it'd be 1 4th grader, 1 5th grader, 1 2nd grader. And so there's almost no impact on class sizes, but we have to find a way to cut the equivalent of a full teacher salary. And so that is why declining enrollment has such a significant impact. We are anticipating each year our enrollment decline to be 1 to 2%. Again, we have the data. We're looking at kindergartners, 1st graders, 2nd graders. Each of those groups of students in our district are about 800 students. The senior class is about 1,200 students. So when you have 1,200 students graduate and they're only backfilled by a new kindergarten group of 750 to 800 kids, that's where you see a 2% enrollment decline. I know I could keep going, but I know there's more questions.
I just want to take a moment to re-emphasize something that Mr. Cantwell stated earlier, and that is to really help our public understand and correct the narrative that our declining enrollment is because we're not doing well, and that our schools aren't doing well, or that our programs aren't robust, because that's simply not true. What we have is a societal problem that is affecting most cities, most states, definitely LA County. And a lot of that has to do with the things that Mr. Cantwell talked about, which is, families deciding they can't have 5 kids or 4 kids and they're only having 1 kid, or later pregnancies and the other things that he shared. I think that's really important because although the conversation is bleak when it comes to the budget, it's not a reflection of how well we're doing as a district and how well our schools are doing.
I'm going to read 2 more questions, and then there's some of the questions that are coming up are going to be covered in future slides. We can revisit those. But one of those is, if Mr. Cantwell, you can explain briefly what measure ABC, the bond measure, and how that impacts the budget as it has limitations. Could you explain that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I see that we have, again, a large group participating in tonight's LCAP. And so I do want to take a moment before I explain Measure ABC to simply thank you. We thank this community that you guys stepped up for education in November, and that we were able to pass Measure ABC. It was a $458 million facility bond. It is a generational investment in the modernization and updating and repair of our facilities. However, the key term there is to focus on facilities. I know that Dr. Weisberg, one of our board members, is on this, and she has shared with me the phrase that bonds are for buildings and parcel taxes are for people. The bond helps our budget in that it will help us avoid having certain expenditures that would have hit the general fund be able to be funded out of the bond. For instance, we have failing roofs. The winds actually are allowing us to repair some of those with insurance dollars because they got much worse from the wind earlier this month. But we have tens of millions of dollars that need to still be replaced soon. Had Measure ABC not passed, we would have had no choice but to fund those repairs or roof replacements from our general fund, and only made the financial picture more bleak. So because the community supported ABC, we're able to make those improvements, make those investments to ensure that our facilities are adequate for education, not just today, but for a decade from now and beyond. But it does not directly improve our general fund outlook, except for, again, defraying some of those costs that may have hit.
Thank you. There's a question about looking at the option of requiring the lunch program application as part of our enrollment process, and whether that's legal or not. And that is not an option that we can do. We cannot require families to complete the meal or lunch application.
That's
But
correct.
we have recently made progress in reducing any barriers for families to complete that. Last question that we're going to look at before we move through the presentation. Second, while I find it. Oh, do we have updates on the changing of the funding model for average daily attendance to funding based on enrollment?
Yeah, I know I've gone far beyond my time, so I'll try to be succinct. That solution of changing our funding from average daily attendance to enrollment does not solve any problems. In fact, Burbank would be a loser because we have high attendance relative to, for instance, LA Unified, unless they fix the underlying problem of funding education. If it's purely a change in the way in which the dollars get sent out to districts, it does not help us. If they're able to increase the commitment to Prop 98, then it would be a significant increase in revenue for us in excess of 6%.
Thank you, Mr. Cantwell. We're going to move on with the presentation. I know a lot of people are here to get some information about our LCAP supplemental budget specifically.
And Dr. Anders, I'm going to mute myself and turn off my screen, but I will be available for when we have Q&A at the end.
Thank you. I appreciate our board member, Emily Weisberg, responding in the chat. So we'll continue to do that as we move through the next couple slides. So just a brief explanation of supplemental funds as part of our LCFF budget. LCFF is our local control funding formula here in the state of California. What Mr. Cantwell explained previously was our base funding for the most part. These are unrestricted funds that we can use to run our schools. In addition to that, as part of LCF funding in the state of California, we receive supplemental funding. This provides supplemental monies equal to about 20% of the base grant for any students who are identified as an English language learner, students in foster care, students who are experiencing homeless, or students who are experiencing socially economically disadvantaged situations. Additional funding that the state provides that we do not receive here in Burbank is concentration funding. This is an additional 55% boost to that child's funding if they meet those categories, if we're over the 55% threshold of students. And we do not meet that threshold to receive any concentration funding. We do receive supplemental funding based on our enrollment. And the next slide outlines how those two funding sources look. This is part of our LCAP plan, and it is our budget overview of our total LCFF funding and general fund, along with our supplemental funding and what that looks like in comparison. Also outlined in here is another visual of what Mr. Cantwell shared about other federal funds and other state funds that total our entire budget. But this is a good visual of the different funding and what we have. I had mentioned that there's different subgroups that bring in the supplemental funding that we receive. This chart shows the enrollment in those subgroups over the last 3 years and our current enrollment. These students are termed unduplicated in that If they meet any of these criteria, they count in this group, but they do not get counted more than once, even if they meet multiple criteria. So example being a homeless student also qualifying as socially economic disadvantaged. We don't count that student twice. That student only counts one, even though they meet multiple criteria. So that's where our total unduplicated doesn't exactly add up if you're doing the math across the row, because you may have students in multiple categories. You can see though that we have been able to maintain our population in these groups, which has led to somewhat stable funding for our supplemental budget. But we're still very concerned about declining enrollment in these numbers. We've in part been able to sustain these numbers because we've really campaigned hard to fill out free and reduced lunch applications and reduce barriers as a school district. So this is our first interim budget update. So this is broken out by our 3 LCAP goals that we spend funds on. We do have 4 goals total. We just don't have any expenditures in our supplemental fund for goal 4, which is our facilities goal. You can see the spending there. We've made investments and spent the majority of our funding on our instructional services. You can see the carryover from last year in the tune of about $1.2 million. Projected revenue for this year and our projected carryover going into next year, which is $373,000. This shows how the carryover has reduced over the last few years. So the primary reason we've had to reduce expenses or what we've been able to fund in our LCAP is because we've been spending down carryover that accumulated during the COVID-19 pandemic. Certain services we were not able to provide in distance learning, or we had grant monies or other funding sources that were one-time monies that had to be spent. And so we were able to effectively save some of our supplemental funds and use them down the road. And we have used those down the road to balance our budget. We're just now in a situation where those carryover dollars are no longer going to exist. So we had previously carried over 3 million, then 2 million, and then now the 1.2. And then you can see that we're projecting about 373 carryover at the end of this year, which equates to if we fund everything next year as we have this year with around the same revenues, we're going to be in excess of about 500,000. So that's what we're here to discuss tonight, is how we're able to reduce our supplemental budget for 25-26 by the tune of $500,000. So just to emphasize that and make that very clear, we do need to have those conversations and adjust accordingly in order to support these subgroups. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Paramo, who's going to discuss some of the items that we're looking at as far as reductions, and then also explain some of the ways we can reallocate by making necessary reductions to provide services, those same services.
Thank you, Dr. Anders. I am going to focus my comments on reductions, possible reductions to the LCAP plan moving forward. However, before I do that, I do want to take a minute and talk a little bit about other reductions and where they're coming from, because I believe for the general public it becomes confusing, because not all of our reductions come out of the LCAP plan. So I'm going to take a very short step backwards, and I am going to make some overarching comments about last year. So last year in our general fund budget, we cut about $4.5 million. In March, I, along with Mr. Cantwell, were invited and I'm using the word invited loosely because it was actually mandatory, we had to meet with the county superintendent. And the county superintendent congratulated us for making the reductions of $4.5 million, but emphasized that it was not enough and that we were not going to get positive certification of our budget unless we made deeper cuts. The Burbank Unified School District attempted to do that. By law, we were allowed to make cuts during the summertime. And we allocated an additional $1.5 million in cuts that would have taken place in the summertime, except our efforts were blocked. The governor struck a deal with California Teachers Association and decided he was not going to allow summer layoffs. So that 1.5 million additional cuts to our general fund were put into a fiscal stabilization plan that went to the Los Angeles County Office of Education and was contractually approved, and we are obligated to make those cuts. So what cuts are we talking about? So I want to be specific about them. In our fiscal stabilization plan that was approved last June and was made public to the Burbank community were the following: 5 PE teachers, 5 PE aides, 5 counselors at the secondary, director of human resources, and then we had teacher reductions in both elementary and secondary. Those are all part of the stabilization plan that was approved in the county almost a year ago. It was back in June. And we are obligated to move forward with those cuts. Those cuts I just listed were discussed at length and are not new. They are not things I want to cut, but this is where we landed last year, and this is what has become part of the plan, and we are required to execute that. So those cuts were cuts that were identified last year and were made known to the public last year. What we're talking about right now and what I'll discuss moving forward is the fact that we still have to cut $500,000 in the LCAP plan. Now, if I just cut $500,000 from LCAP, that means that there are no other items that can be added because we don't have any more money. So if we want to add other things, then we have to cut more than $500,000, which happens every year. It's happened every year since LCAP came about. We've made adjustments. Some things we find are working. Some things we run into obstacles because we can't fill positions. So the point being is when I'm going to list these reductions and speak to you about them and to explain them, it's going to total more than $500,000. And that is because if we need to add anything new, we needed to cut deeper. So let me go ahead and begin. And if there are questions, I will answer them. We made huge cuts last year to the LCAP budget when it came to secondary summer school. For the first time ever last summer, we outsourced summer school. So what does that mean? Kids who failed classes and needed to make them up, or kids that received Ds and needed to do grade improvement, were allowed to do it. And they were allowed to do it for free using other platforms, specifically charter schools who run summer programs that are free of cost, because when you sign up for one of these programs, they're collecting money for your daily attendance at the summer school. So I can tell you by looking at the data that outsourcing summer school did not prevent any of our kids from making up what they needed to make up. They were still able to get it done. We still came out with a 96% graduation rate, and our kids got it done. We are cutting our summer school program again by $30,000. It's a reduce in funding. Will BUSD offer summer school? Yes. What summer school will BUSD be offering? Here's what it's going to look like. It will mean that we will fund special ed extended year summer school. That will continue. We will continue to provide summer school for RSP kids to either remediate a class that they failed or to improve a class that they didn't do well in. So we'll still continue to do that. We will provide a mechanism for our 8th graders to take 1 semester of health and 1 semester of economics. We've always provided this option for incoming 9th graders so that they can take world language as a freshman if they want to do that. And we will continue to do that. We can do this with a smaller budget, so we're reducing by $30,000. The Hanover Research Group, last year, we increased that budget because we were tasking Hanover to do some focus groups and to do some more extensive research and surveys with our families, with our kids, with our staff, as it pertains to mental health. So that work is being done now. In fact, we are starting small interviews with students and families and staff coming up in the next couple weeks. And so that budget last year was increased by about $50,000. We don't have to have it as high next year. So there's a reduction of $60,000 to the Hanover Research Group. And that the money that is allocated for Hanover is to do our basic survey, which is our climate survey. And we do that, or student satisfaction survey. We do that in the spring because it's compulsory. We need to have that data available when we are sending in documentation for things like LCAP and other grants and things that require us to have survey data for our families. So it's a reduction of $60,000. We are reducing DEI consultant. We were paying $47,000 to have a consultant do the work and help us support our principals and our school sites. We are still continuing this work. However, this is work that is being picked up by both myself, Dr. Macias, and Ms. Rebecca Harris. And between the 3 of us, we are doing that work and reducing the budget by $47,000. The next item is paraeducators in the dual immersion program. This is actually a reduction that was recommended by our 2 elementary principals who have dual immersion. They felt that this would be manageable without the aides for a couple reasons. Our dual immersion classes tend to become a lot smaller in grades 3, 4, and 5. They tend to be in the range of 20, 21, 22 students in the classroom, and about 40 or 45% of the kids are English speaking, and they felt that it was manageable without the aides. So that is a $163,000 reduction in our LCAP budget. As it pertains to curriculum specialist, we have 11, and there's 1 at every elementary school site. And the reduction is a reduction of 2 curriculum specialists, and I'd like to explain. Our 2 larger elementary schools, which are Jefferson Elementary and Miller, because their population size is so large, it's very difficult on the principal who has to be in every IEP for that school. It is not something that can be handed over to anyone else. An administrator needs to be there. There's a principal. And what we are doing for Jefferson and for Miller is eliminating the curriculum specialist so that those 2 schools can hire an assistant principal. The assistant principal for those 2 schools will be able to share the load of IEPs. They'll also be able to share the load on discipline. And for those 2 schools in particular, we think that that is a good move. So it's a reduction of 2 curriculum specialists. The rest of the schools will maintain their normal curriculum specialist. There is a reduction of 11 intervention specialists. This is a very difficult item to be looking at for reduction. What I can tell you is that what we are looking at is how can we provide similar service and potentially save money. One of the main tasks for the intervention specialist is working with the kids on social emotional curriculum. That is not going to go away. That is important. We are looking at how to do this by using teaching staff and using other staff at the school site to be able to do that. We are also looking at adding 3 SOAR intervention specialists which will also serve the elementary, but I'll get to that on the next slide. So the reduction would be the reduction of 11 intervention specialists. Response to intervention RTI, this is a reduction of $85,000. Again, not something we want to do, but there is still a very healthy and robust budget for RTI at the elementary. It's a reduction. It's not, there's still enough money to serve our 11 elementary schools. Interpreters and translators, a reduction of 75,000. That is a natural break. We did not use all the money that was allocated last year. So reducing $75,000 isn't because we're cutting services, because we didn't use all the money that we allocated last year. And so this makes sense to reduce the budget by $75,000. The DEI collaboration time for our DEI site teacher leads, we are not eliminating that. We're reducing that by $10,000. The next item in the amount of $220,000 is our instructional support. So we had the best intentions. It's one of the things that our principals spoke out about last year when we added this to the LCAP. They really felt the need for instructional aides in the ELD classrooms. We supported that. The fact of the matter is that we flew these positions for months and months and months, and we're not able to fill those positions. And so that money sat empty last year, and the decision was made to reduce it from the LCAP budget. Do we still need ELD aides? Of course we do. In order to fill these positions, we're going to have to work through budget development to see what we can do to increase that. But it's hard to increase this salary when we're in a budget deficit. So we are going to work through that problem and figure out what it is that we need to do. These are the proposed reductions in the LCAP plan. Clearly, it amounts to more than $500,000. So what are we going to do with the money, additional money that is available for other resources? I want to go through that with you now. So the assistant principal for Miller and Jefferson would come out to $262,540. The next 2 items are positions that our current intervention specialists would be eligible to apply for. This is a different job description. This requires more attention to students who are chronically absent. It requires them to be liaison with the Burbank Police Department, to hold SARB meetings, to have parents come to the table with social workers, the district attorney, and to discuss a plan on how to get their children to come to school. Those are 3 positions that would work specifically with elementary kids. So the configuration of that could look like one that serves the district as a whole, and then a separate one for Miller or Jefferson, although the principals and Dr. Knapik and Rebecca Harris are still working on the configuration. We put that in as a possible way that those 3 people can be utilized to serve the elementary schools. The big thing coming from our elementary principals is a desperate need for help when it comes to students who are displaying dysregulated behavior. And I want to explain a little bit about this. Sometimes when kids enter the Burbank Unified School District, because they really want to come here, may not disclose that their child is special ed, or they exited special ed at their previous school, so that when they applied to Burbank, they would be applying as a general ed student, and therefore they think they have a better chance of getting into Burbank. And then we find out that their child has special needs that were not identified to us because we had no idea. And what we have are kids that are displaying severe behavioral issues, oftentimes kids who are eloping classrooms, and they're not staffed or equipped to deal with that. Each of our school does have time with a behavior interventionist, but the time is limited. And what principals are asking for is the possibility of reallocating our current resources and getting additional resources to help with this dysregulated behavior. And so the current budget proposal would be to add 7 behavior interventionists at the cost of $763,735. That, along with our current staffing that support elementary schools, would mean that every elementary school would get a behavior interventionist full-time at their school, and that is what our principals are telling us they need. We are allocating a very small amount, $20,000, to help Title I schools who have trouble fundraising for outdoor science school, a budget that would help them to cover the gap. A lot of times our Title I schools work very hard to fundraise, but they fall short. They could fall short by $5,000. And what is currently happening is the principal at that school is having to use their school site budget to cover that gap because they couldn't do it by fundraising. And this provides a small pot of money that would help those schools to fund for outdoor science school, which is important to our community and our kids. And so there's a small budget for that. And that is, I talked about the intervention specialists already. That is what the additional expenditures would be based on the needs that were expressed when working with our principals.
There's one specific question I want to make sure we get to before we address some other questions. And that was about the dual immersion program. Are we looking at only reducing aides in upper classrooms and not the lower primary grades? Do we know that?
Yeah, we can work with our elementary principals at both those school sites to define that more specifically. It does make sense to me that that would come from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Having said that, I believe our kinder is at 25 in the classroom with about 45%, 40% that are English speaking. So I don't have the specific answer, but I will definitely get that back to the public. And it's a great question. I also want to say, one other thing. And it's so hard because sometimes things get lost in translation, and I'm going to be really bummed if this gets lost in translation. So I'm trying to choose my words carefully, and I'm trying to express this the right way. When I look at these budget cuts that we're proposing for this year, it would seem to most people that this is very centered on elementary school. And I want to acknowledge that that is true. But I want to explain the reason why. Last year, the brunt of our budget cuts came from the secondary level. Now, what I want to say about that is they took the brunt of the budget cuts because they had more. So it makes sense to me that secondary took a pretty heavy lift. The problem is that there's very little left at the secondary to cut. There's almost nothing in the LCAP plan that is specific to secondary. So when we're trying to cover a gap of $500,000 and we've already taken everything from the secondary, including this year, the additional 5 counselors, I don't have anything left. This really has gotten to the point where we are having to look specifically at elementary because everything else in the LCAP is specifically targeting the population it's supposed to target, which are our English language learners, our socioeconomically disadvantaged, our homeless, our foster, and for Burbank, although it's not an identified group in other districts, it's also taking care of special ed kids because there are services in the LCAP plan that do take care of special ed kids. Yeah, no, the question was, can you tell me a little bit about the difference between a behavior interventionist and the position we're cutting, which are the intervention specialists? So the intervention specialists are the folks that are working with students who at the elementary level right now, because we eliminated secondary last year, and they are working with kids on social emotional curriculum so that they are exposed to that. And we do have a program, and they are teaching the lessons with that. They are definitely working with kids in terms of behavior when it comes to getting a group of kids together to resolve conflict resolution. That's definitely happening. And they're working with kids in that regard. The difference with a behavior interventionist is that they have special training on how to de-escalate a student who is exhibiting assertive, forceful, sometimes dangerous, physical interactions. They're throwing chairs. They are pounding fists, they're pounding walls, they're pounding desks. They are I don't have a better word. They're having a fit and somebody needs to help them. And oftentimes that means that they need to be removed from the classroom and they need to work with the student to de-escalate the behavior. That takes a specific skill set. That takes specific training. And that also takes training in terms of the physicality. What happens if they become a danger to themselves or others? What do you have to do to physically maintain safety? And that is a skill set that is specific. And that's why the behavior interventionist is something that our leaders are asking for.
I'm going to pause for a second with questions. There's just a few more slides that want to make sure we all get an opportunity to look at for context. This is included in the appendix that will be posted. But this is a listing of all of our current instructional goals for this school year and the cost associated with those. So we have our budgeted column as well as where we are at first interim. Again, first interim is a projection of where we anticipate we'll end the year as far as expenditures on these items. This was a question in the chat earlier. Why are we always looking at personnel first? The reason is that 90% of our supplemental budget is personnel. So in order to make any cuts or reductions, it's necessary to look at those. The next slide is our instructional goal continued. So these are additional action items that we currently fund in our LCAP plan and are in place this year. Again, the budgeted amount and our projection at first interim to support these goals. Goal 2 is our ed services goal. Think of this as the whole child. So not necessarily instructionally focused, but making sure students have everything they need to be successful in the classroom. And so this is some of our wraparound positions and services that we provide to our students. And you can see again the budgeted and first interim numbers there. Our third goal is centered around retaining high quality staff. This is our goal 3, and you can see the budgeted and first interim. The first item on here is 0 for at first interim. This is a position we determined not to fill and to use our in-house staff members to support that item. So wanted to share those just for context so you can see. Oh, okay. I noticed a typo on one of the slides where it was transposed. Yes, $1 million towards professional development on this slide and the 19,000. So just flip those two numbers. Apologize for that. Okay, so we're going to circle back to some questions that have come up. We have an in-person question, and then we'll get to some questions in the chat. I do want to acknowledge that Dr. Paramo, our superintendent, did have to leave the meeting. He has a PTA event tonight, very similar in nature of responding to questions with our parent-teacher organization about the budget and other items at the school district. But go ahead.
Okay. Hi. I would like to make a quick point of clarification and first I want to start with, I know this is a very large, complicated, complex problem to solve. So thank you everyone who spent time trying to solve this problem, because I realize there's a lot of moving pieces and it's a difficult problem to solve. One piece that causes big alarm for me is the paraeducator dual immersion program removal. And I did want to clarify, it was said that the aides that would be removed would be in grades 3, 4, and 5. And I do want to clarify, there are no aides in grades 4 and 5. This is really looking at eliminating all of the aides for all of the grades. And even though this doesn't sound like something that is a big piece of the puzzle, because it doesn't affect all students at the elementary level, I do want to express that this is a major impact to the dual immersion program. And I do want to express that this will have a major impact to the success of the program, because the grades that do receive these aids, kindergarten, first, second, third, are the ages where the children, especially the non-native speakers, are not understanding what the teacher is saying. And so this aid really allows the teacher to create small groups, allows the aid is allowed to break language a little bit to help that student really succeed in the program. So eliminating these positions is really detrimental to the dual immersion program. Now, this is where it is impactful to all students. The dual immersion program is one of the only, we were talking about all the socioeconomic reasons that enrollment is dropping. The dual immersion program is one of the only attractions to the elementary schools. We have seen firsthand, when there is a second class to dual immersion, how many more students are enrolled. And so in essence, it increases our enrollment and it increases our funding across the district. And so I just want to make sure that it is understood. If this is cut, it is detrimental to the program. There is an ELD benefit when students from other Spanish-speaking countries come into elementary school at a higher grade level. They are able to integrate into the dual immersion program, boosting up those class sizes, but also, again, implementing the success of that student, because now they're learning in their native language, which is in essence what we began talking about, that ELD component that is very crucial to the district. Additionally, I am concerned for another aspect of the program success, which is teacher retention. Eliminating an aid that has been instrumental to the program since the inception of the program essentially doubles the workload of the kindergarten, first grade, second grade, maybe by third grade, not so much, but like kindergarten, first grade, second grade is key. And it will be very impactful to those teachers, because in essence, it will double their workload, because half of their classroom does not understand the language that they are speaking. I know that this doesn't impact all students, but I think in all of these roundabout ways, it does impact the district larger than what is being represented today. So I just want to make sure that is extremely clear. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. Your comments are being echoed in the chat. This is why we have these meetings. We need to hear from our parents and community about the impacts of some of the conversations we're having. I also want to acknowledge we have Dr. Peter Knappich, soon to be Dr. Rebecca Harris, listening to our conversation. So we note these comments and take them very seriously as we do want this input. And if we need to have further conversations about what we're discussing as far as our LCAP for next year, we take this into consideration. So thank you. And thank you for those in the chat for your support as well. It's been a minute since I've had a chance to review, but now is the opportunity to unmute. So if you would like to ask your question, or you had posted a question to the chat and didn't receive a response, we can take those questions now. While I wait for any speakers, I'm going to check the chat to make sure we've addressed as much as we can. Questions about enrollment? We do open up. It's about 10% of our current enrollment is permit students. The requirement to be able to enroll your child is to work at least 10% of the work week in Burbank, whether that's self-employed or through a business or other avenue. So there's ample opportunities for those families to enroll. There's questions about why some of these positions are in the supplemental budget as opposed to the general fund. There's a couple reasons for that. One, our general fund typically gives us just enough operating dollars to fund classroom teachers and the necessary positions to run the school. These supplemental dollars are in addition to those general fund dollars that are geared specifically to support the unduplicated pupil count, our English learners, foster youth, homeless, and socially economic disadvantaged. So these monies are specific to provide some of these out of the classroom services that we're able to provide with those. So it's twofold. One, we need to dedicate these dollars to those students that need these services. But second, general fund typically does not cover the costs of establishing or maintaining these outside of the classroom positions or services. Okay. I don't know that we have any other questions to entertain at this time. We do have additional meetings and nothing has been decided. This is our initial budget conversation that we bring to our community. These slides, the recording of tonight will be posted on our LCAP website. We will review the chat to make sure we provide responses to the questions. Our next meeting we'll have 2 in February. We will be having our goal 1 instructional services goal overview. And then our second meeting in February will be ed services. And we'll talk about both the expenditures and the items within those in more detail, as well as how we're measuring progress towards our goals and how those services are having a positive impact. I do see we have one more question. We're gonna take that, and then I will repost the link in the chat to our LCAP website where these materials live for future meetings, and as well as where we'll post tonight's information.
My question is, in terms of as a parent, next steps, what can parents do from here? So obviously a lot of information has been presented. There's a lot of different opinions as to how this puzzle should be solved. How do parents get their feedback to the district and hopefully change the outcome of this puzzle solving?
Sure. We request that you continue to be an active participant in our LCAP meetings, so both in February and March. Before spring break, it's again posted on our website. Our March meeting will be to revisit this budget conversation and propose what we intend to move forward with as a budget for next year. So we take this feedback, we'll continue to have conversations, bring the information we received tonight to our principals, share that with them to determine if we need to pivot or adjust. You can also contact Dr. Knappich, Ms. Rebecca Harris, myself, Dr. Paramo, Oscar Macias, our interim assistant superintendent of instructional services. I know Mr. Cantwell was on the call earlier. He also can entertain any of these questions related to the general budget and et cetera. If I'm not able to answer your question or any of us, we will make sure we relay that question to somebody that can get back to you with specifics or how that will impact students. Okay. I appreciate you all. The goal of tonight is to be as transparent as possible. I know this is difficult news, and any of these decisions that we're discussing are not in the best interest of our kids, but they're necessary decisions in order for us to be fiscally solvent. So appreciate your time and attention, and we'll stay in contact before our next meeting. Thank you all.